Chapter 1, Let's Be Homeless, Part 2. The one stipulation with me living there was that I had to get a real job and quit working for the newspaper. Benny was working at the original Fuddruckers Hamburgers down the street from Jonathan's house, so I decided to work there. It was kind of depressing. I made more money and it was a lot more fun selling papers than it was flipping burgers. I'd pull in at least $400 a week working for John, but I was lucky to make a couple hundred every 2 weeks at Fuddruckers. Lucky for me, Jonathan's mom only charged me $80 a month to live in her garage. Shortly after I moved in, I was arrested for the first time in my life. It was just after I turned 17, so I was convicted as an adult for breaking into a vehicle. Luckily, Texas had recently downgraded my crime from a felony to a misdemeanor, and I didn't have to stay in jail long. However, they gave me a horrible probation stint with a strict, tight-nosed probation officer. He made sure I was under constant supervision and gave me as hard of his time as he could. When I wasn't visiting my PO, I'd be performing the unreasonable amount of community service I was given, where I did back-breaking labor at a park, digging ditches for 8 hours straight without pay in the hot Texas sun. Cruel and unusual punishment. I still hung around the same crowd and everyone still smoked pot. My friends weren't quitting on my behalf. They didn't care if I was on probation, and they did everything they could to keep me to continue smoking. One time, I woke up in the middle of the night with Benny blowing a huge bong hit in my face the night before a drug test. My 6 months of probation seemed like a death sentence. When you're a teenager, 6 months is an eternity. I didn't know how I was going to survive without smoking pot. Hanging out with my friends and smoking weed was my identity at the time, and identity is the most important thing for a teenager. I wanted to continue my lifestyle, but I needed a substitute for weed, so I started using alcohol. There were lots of stores who'd sell alcohol to minors back then. Every morning, I'd wake up, walk to the corner, and buy a 40 ounce, which I drank with the hobos in the abandoned parking lot across the street. Certain people shouldn't be on probation. In December of that year, I found out that my probation had been revoked and I was to begin serving a 2-month adult jail sentence at the Bexar County Jail and Zero Tolerance Boot Camp facility. Adversity comes in bunches, and right around the time I found out I was going to jail, Jonathan's mom found the pot garden her son and I had been cultivating in the backyard. The plants were my idea. I was on probation and couldn't smoke, so I figured the least I could do was grow some weed for my friends. Jonathan's mom would have been okay with the plants, but she was stressing out because of her son's new girlfriend. Jonathan had recently started dating an attractive woman much older than he was. He'd just turned 16, but his new, very serious girlfriend was 37. He met her at a local neighborhood crack house. It wasn't what you expect when you hear the term crack house. It was a decent house in a middle-class neighborhood that looked completely ordinary if you were ever to drive by. The caretaker was a middle-aged junkie named Tona. Tona lived down the street from Benny. One day, one of her friend's kids were playing basketball in the driveway, and Benny was riding by doing tricks on his rollerblades. Benny asked to join the basketball game, and when Tona came out to introduce herself, Benny pulled her aside and whispered, "Do you smoke marijuana?" And she laughed. Everybody loved Tona. She was in her 30s but acted like a teenager. Tona had an endless amount of beer and weed for us kids. There were plenty of hard drugs used there, but she did a good job of keeping all the heavy stuff in the back room away from anyone too young to handle it. All day, different races and ages would come and go from Tona's house. Some were there to buy drugs, some were there to see Tona, and some just wandered in from the alley or the street. The television was always on. Tona only watched MTV. This was back when the station played music, so it served as an excellent backdrop for all the drug use and interesting characters that frequented her living room. Tona had a huge crack addiction, and I saw firsthand how drugs can destroy someone's vision of reality. She smoked rock, but when she wanted a change of pace or to get really high, she'd eject it into her foot. Sometimes I'd help her find a tourniquet in an open vein. Her husband, Harry, always kept her supplied. We were lucky to have a friend like Tona, and we'd spend almost every night either at her house or Benny's backyard, drinking her beer and smoking her weed. Tona hooked us up. She was one of the most generous people I've ever known, but cocaine does that to you. She taught us very useful things like how to control your boozing and drink all day. She also taught us how to roll joints with a dollar, open imported beers with a lighter, and use the stove to light a cigarette. All of this would come in handy later in life. Tonas gave us insight into the adult world she knew we'd encounter. In return, we gave her attention. Tona was an agoraphobic drug addict who liked people around her constantly. The only time she left her house was when she had her crackhead husband drop her across town at her crackhead boyfriend's ghetto apartment for a few nights. Her day revolved more on who would come over and what would happen in her living room rather than where she went or what she got accomplished. Tona's husband, Harry, was old, in his 70s or 80s. He was a crackhead too, but he wouldn't start using until he got off of work. He reminded people of John Wayne. Their relationship revolved around a drug use. Harry met Tona when she was working at McDonald's, her first and only job. I never saw them nice or romantic with each other. It was all about the drugs. Tona was 40 years younger than Harry and played the part of his daughter in their sick relationship. Harry's real daughter refused to speak to him, understandably. Harry was the sole breadwinner with a small rose business he owned and operated out of their house. The roses he sold paid for their mortgage and crack. Every morning he'd wake up early, drive to a rose farm, and buy a bunch of flowers wholesale. At night he'd take attractive women around in his old Cadillac to the sad dive bars and strip clubs. His rose girls would then approach the bar's inebriated patrons and ask them if they would like to buy a flower. Harry's rose business supported their lifestyle and enabled them to live in a decent house. There were sexy women in their living room every night. Nothing's better when you're 16 than smoking pot and drinking beer with curvy dames in short skirts and elaborate blouses. Most of the girls working for Harry were only interested in money, so the last thing on their mind was a teenager. But one girl stood out. Janet from another planet was a dark-haired beauty with hair like electric space. She'd been working for Harry off and on for a few years. Most of Harry's girls would spend the majority of the night in the back room doing hard drugs, but Janet stayed in the living room and smoked pot with us kids. She hardly even drank. When the other girls would be behind closed doors doing dirty things for money, Janet would be in the living room watching MTV and hitting our homemade bong. Janet fit in with our group. We didn't think of her as a 37-year-old. She was older than Jonathan's mom, but hanging out with Janet wasn't like hanging out with Jonathan's mom. We were a breath of fresh air for her, too. She'd gotten tired of all the aggressive jerks she'd been meeting at bars and strip clubs while slanging roses for Harry. Janet was planning on hooking up with one of us from the start. She initially wanted me, obviously, but I knew anything long-term wouldn't have worked out. Jonathan, on the other hand, was ready and willing for a relationship and wasn't bothered by their age difference. Janet was an incredible person inside and out, and no one blamed Jonathan for hooking up with her. He was definitely dating out of his league. John's mom was the only person who had a problem with it, and it didn't necessarily have anything to do with Janet or who she was as a person. The problem was that Janet was older than she was, and she felt like she was being replaced. Janet would smoke weed with us in the woods or at Benny's shed every night, but John's mom would never do anything like that. His mom might buy us beer, but it was always forced and awkward. The biggest difference was that Janet spoke to us like equals, and that's the best way to earn respect at any age. There's a big difference between someone who drinks and someone who smokes weed. With weed, you can drive a car, study for a test, or operate heavy machinery. With alcohol, you can't even walk in a straight line or make complete sentences. No one has ever died from pot, but on average, 6 people die in the U.S. daily from alcohol poisoning. Jonathan's mom drank and Janet smoked weed. Janet was a well-grounded person enjoying her life, and Jonathan's mom was swimming in cheap wine while trying to control her dopey son. His mom used the pot garden as an excuse to not only kick me out, but also show her son just how much she disapproved of his relationship with the older woman who she refused to meet. Youth doesn't fathom how bad things can get, and the future always feels like it's going to be great. Jonathan and I figured this whole homeless thing was going to be a grand experience. When I look back, I see that he had no reason to worry. Even though we both joked about the fact that we were now bums, Jonathan was never really homeless at all. He was just humoring me. The only thing on his mind was his new girlfriend, and now he had an excuse to move in with her. We left his mom's house and walked to the woods we'd spent many times hanging out in before. It took an hour for his weakness to show, saying he wanted to call Janet and tell her what happened. "I'll be back in a minute," he said. "I'm just going to run to the payphone across the street." I waited in the cold and the optimism I had faded. A bolt of nervousness hit me when I realized he was going to leave me in the woods and stay with his girlfriend. Being young and homeless is not something you want to do alone. At that moment, I realized the world is a much colder place than I had ever thought it was. I finally got a grip of reality and how much it relates to my happiness and well-being. When Jonathan finally got back, he had an incredibly dumb look on his face. He strolled up to where I was sitting in the woods and wouldn't make eye contact. Instead, he made silly comments about the weather while blowing into his hands for warmth. I asked him what took him so long, but he wouldn't answer. There was a brief moment of silence before I stood up, looked him in the eye, and asked if he was ditching me. Listen, I don't know if you're not going to want to hear this, he said, but it's obvious that you're jealous of Jen and me and you want what we have. John Boy was more confident than I'd ever seen him before. Here's the deal. You're either with me or against me, and if you're against me, then you can go screw yourself. I didn't know how to respond to my best friend. I honestly didn't care about him or his 37-year-old girlfriend. I had the more immediate concern about freezing to death in the woods. I kept my cool, took a breath, and asked, well, if I'm with you instead of against you, does that mean I can go to Janet's house too? Jonathan threw his hands up and yelled, no, this is exactly what I mean. You just want what we have. You're jealous. I was upset, but I didn't show it. It wouldn't have been practical. I told Jonathan that I'd wait with him until his girlfriend showed up, keeping hope he'd change his mind and invite me to come to the warm house too. When Janet finally pulled up in the road adjacent to the woods, she didn't bother getting out of her truck. Jonathan ran out to the street and shouted, "Laters," without turning around. When they drove away and I was out of sight, I let out my pain. I screamed and shouted and kicked some innocent trees. When I finished my tantrum, I sat on a rock and noticed how sweaty I'd gotten from the exertion. I took off my jacket and concentrated on each cloud of smoke my breath made. 20 minutes later, the sweat on my body turned cold and I began to shiver. My legs started getting numb. I was showing the signs of hyperthermia. I thought about knocking on Benny's window, but then I realized he was on vacation in South Padre, so I limped to the only apartments nearby and stumbled around its buildings until I found a closet, a patio, or a hole to crawl inside. I finally found the apartment's laundromat, but the door was locked, so I climbed up a ledge and jimmied open one of the windows before using the last bit of strength I had left to pull my freezing body up by my forearms and slide inside. I landed plop on the laundry room floor in a warm room with a comforting laundry smell. There was a slight radio playing in the background that added Good, huh? That added to my feeling of well-being. I crawled under a table, slid behind a trash can, and fell sound asleep. I woke up a few hours later to the sound of an early riser doing his laundry. He didn't say anything or tell me to leave, so I rolled back into a ball and continued sleeping. A few hours later, I slithered out to the street. The sun came out from behind the clouds, and I felt the relief to having survived my first freezing night outside. I didn't know where to go from there, so I wandered around the neighborhood I grew up in like a lost dog whose family moved without telling him. I finally ended up by some railroad tracks that weren't near any streets, people, or businesses. It was the best place to hide the shame of being homeless and unloved. For the rest of the day, I wrote poems about being beaten alone by the railroad tracks. At the time, I had a maudlin notion of one day writing a great book. I watched the freight trains go by and I tried to figure things out. The only people you ever saw by these railroad tracks were the stereotypic homeless people, the kind with shaggy beards and filthy hands, holding cardboard signs, standing on street corners. I hung around the tracks alone for a few hours. I didn't write any great poetry, but I did find a piece of aluminum foil that had a half-burnt bowl of pot still in it. I smoked the pot, meditated, and tried to find some sort of purpose or direction in life. Getting high put me in a better mood, and I was actually able to laugh about my situation. Later that afternoon, I noticed two bums slowly walking toward me. I got a little nervous and began to plan out what I was going to say. I felt like high school all over again. When they got closer, I realized I actually knew one of them. It was a bum I'd smoked weed with named Kenny. Kenny was one of the only few transients who hung around Jonathan's neighborhood. He chilled out with a lot of non-homeless people because he didn't look that homeless, just poor. Kenny was a little over 30 and had a deep East Texan accent that matched his southern mullet, which he always kept combed. He wore decent secondhand clothes, free from cigarette burns and masturbation stains, and always carried a comb and toothbrush wherever he went. It's easy to give up on that kind of thing when you're living on the streets, so you gotta respect someone who keeps himself upright despite sleeping rough. The first night I met Kenny was a week after I moved into Jonathan's garage. It was cold outside and he didn't have anywhere to sleep, so I let him crash on the floor. I figured I was doing the right thing. Before that night, whenever I went to sleep, I'd take my wallet, keys, and whatever else was in my pocket and put it all in one of my shoes. But that night, I let Kenny stay with me in my garage. I woke up with the next morning with exactly half the money in my wallet gone. Since then, I always sleep with my wallets, and they safely snug on my ass. I put Kenny's previous deception in the past because I want someone to talk to. I've been babbling to myself by the railroad tracks all day. This is normal for me, but many men have gone crazy doing the same thing. Kenny was happy to see me, but the guy he was with looked at me like the way you look at a tax collector in biblical times. I spent the rest of the afternoon with my two new homeless pals. Kenny was cool and talkative, but his friend stayed silent with a mean look on his face. Kenny's friend was an ugly old man with warts and missing patches of skin. He kept staring at me and licking his lips, which made him even more creepier than he already was. I made every attempt to convince him I was okay, but nothing seemed to work. When it got dark, Kenny invited me back to their camp. I had no logical choice but to accept. They knew I had no money, so I wasn't that worried about getting robbed. Their site was only about a mile away. It was hidden in between a patch of bushes and an abandoned warehouse. There were beer cans, cigarette butts, and human excrement scattered all over the place, so obviously they'd been there for some time. Kenny lit a small fire where I found a piece of cardboard to lay down on. I used my backpack as a pillow and tried to get comfortable. It wasn't as cold as the night before, and I felt pretty good. I thought of myself as a homeless cowboy under the Texas stars. Humans have been sleeping like this forever, I told myself. Kenny and his friend drank bush beer while I pretended to sleep. I was tired of their conversation. It was fun for the first hour, but I didn't want to keep on thinking of things to say to these stupid bastards. When the conversation got quiet, it felt like something bad was about to happen. To me. When I finally convinced them I was asleep, I realized what was going on. Kenny had some crack that he was planning to share with his wart-covered friend. This is why his friend had been giving me the stink eye all night. He was waiting for Kenny to break out the candy, but Kenny didn't want to pull out with me around. The fire sizzled down and got colder. I heard the sound of crinkling cellophane, but I would continue to pretend to be asleep. I may have been homeless, but I knew smoking crack wouldn't have been a good idea, at least not at this point in my life. After their drugs kicked in, they started being incredibly loud, so I sat up and lit a cigarette. Nobody could pretend to sleep with the commotion they were making. Kenny's dirty friend saw me smoking a cigarette and started screaming, "He's awake! He's awake!" "Yes, I'm awake," I responded. Kenny ran over and started stuttering. "Oh, we were just. He couldn't think of anything to say. "I don't care," I yelled. "I just want to get some sleep." Then I actually did fall asleep, but I woke up at sunrise with Kenny's friend lightly kicking my side. He was screaming at me to hand over the rock. Kenny tried to calm his friend down, but the guy was cracked out of his mind. He thought I'd gotten into his bag and pocketed some crack to smoke by myself. The man was having delusions that I wanted no part of. It was a far cry away from my Kerouesque ideas of writing poetry by the railroad tracks. I had enough. I grabbed my stuff and I bolted like a track star. I knew both of them were too old and out of shape to follow, so I ran away as the faint yells of Kenny bellowing me to come back faded in the distance. When I got far enough, I slowed to a jog. Other than having to carry my huge backpack, it was a peaceful run. It reminded me of track meets in grade school. After the first mile, I saw familiar territory and realized I was only a few blocks from Tona's house. I was hungry, tired, and relieved to see somewhere I was told I was always welcome. I figured I'd tell Tona about the bumps of the railroad tracks and she'd have a good laugh. Tona always loved my stories, but when I got to the edge of her street, I felt a weird vibe coming over me. Something wasn't right, like I shouldn't be there. I'd been there 100 times before, but this time something felt odd, like I'd done something wrong. I rang the doorbell, but nobody answered. I heard the TV on, so I knew someone was home. I knocked loudly until someone finally came to the door. I expected to see Tona, but instead Jonathan appeared with a mean look on his face. He opened the main door, but kept the screen door shut and spoke to me through the wire frame. I was surprised by his coarse behavior, and I asked him what was going on. He stiffened his brow, looked me square in the eye, and firmly said I couldn't come inside. I was stunned. "Where's Tona?" I asked. "She's not home." I knew this was a lie because Tona never left the house. "Look, Jen and I are watching the place until we get a place of our own," he said. "I know what you're trying to do and it's not working." I felt betrayed by the few people I thought were my friends. I was hungry and alone and it would have been nice to go inside somewhere. However, I'd been turned into a villain while I was playing bum at the railroad tracks the night before. I found out later that Janet and Jonathan had moved into Tona's extra bedroom and told her I was trying to ruin their relationship and tear them apart. I left Tona's house and walked to the end of her street and then to the end of her neighborhood. I felt weak, lightheaded, and I hadn't eaten in a while. I wanted to avoid going to Mom and Guy's house before I went to jail, but I needed food. Mom lived about 5 miles from Tona's driveway, and on an empty stomach, I knew it was going to be a long walk, but I figured it'd be worth it to get some food in my belly. I needed to go somewhere where someone gave a shit about me. My twin brother Michael was the closest thing to that I had. During my walk, I figured I'd ask Mom if I could stay a few nights before I went to jail. I wasn't asking for much, and they knew I'd be gone soon. I was actually looking forward to jail. 3 hots and a cot sounded better than anything I had going for me at the time. I'd call my probation officer to see if I could move my surrender date to a couple of weeks earlier than originally planned. I'd do my time, move on with my life, and get out of homelessness. The life of a vagabond wasn't as romantic as I thought, and the only thing I could think about was finding somewhere to live and something to eat. I took my time walking to Mom's, taking plenty of breaks and stopping at a couple different parks for water. When I got to her house, I sat in her driveway for a couple hours before knocking on Michael's window. He was up late working on his artwork, and Mom had already gone to sleep. Michael said he felt lucky they were letting him stay there, and that he didn't envy my position. The last thing he wanted was to me to mess things up for him, so I couldn't come inside, but he said I could hang out in the backyard with their smelly-ass dog, Elmo. He said he'd bring me some food and covers. It was the best offer I'd have, and an hour later, He came out with a blanket, a radio, and some stale hot dog buns. Early the next morning, when Mom and Guy left for work, I broke inside for more food. I made a peanut butter sandwich and laid my sad bones on the couch, falling asleep to the sounds of The Price is Right. I slept on their grungy couch for a few hours before getting up, calling Mom at work. I told her I was going to call my probation officer and start serving my sentence early. I asked Mom if I could stay till then. She was sympathetic, as usual, and heartbroken to see her oldest son going to jail. She told me she tried to convince Guy to let me stay a few nights. Guy let me stay for a week, but he said I had to be gone from morning to midnight and make sure to confirm my new surrender date and get my ass to county jail ASAP. I called my probation officer the next day and explained my situation before asking if I could go to jail early. I want to get it over with, I told him. The officer was surprised. He told me something like, well, I guess you could turn yourself in early, but you weren't scheduled until the end of the month, so I don't know why you would. Even though I had elucidated the tool about my hard-knock circumstances, he wasn't sympathetic. He should have told me that turning myself in early wasn't going to help anything. I was due to be transferred from jail to the zero-tolerance boot camp facility on a particular day. If I turned myself in early, I'd be volunteering to go to jail for no reason. The officer said he needed a moment to think it over. He called me back an hour later and said, yeah, sure, you can turn yourself in early, but I can't guarantee that you'll get out of jail and over to boot camp any earlier than they expected you. During this time in Texas, probation officers felt their job was to get as many people in jail as possible. Every life knocked out of whack was considered a victory. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and the majority of them are there for nonviolent drug offenses. Possession of marijuana is the most common offense. According to the U.S. Bureau of Justice, in 2008 there were over 7 million U.S. citizens in jail, prison, or on probation. That's about 1 in 30. Since 1980, the prison population has quadrupled. A large reason for that is because of mandated sentences which came about during the war on drugs. But the increase comes during a period when crime has actually dropped by 25%. I had a few days of rest at Mom's house before turning myself in. It was nice to eat, sleep, and talk to her before I got locked up. She was worried, so I reassured her that I was going to be in the safe part of the jail. There'd be guards watching us and no one was going to try to beat or rape me. I showed her how many push-ups and sit-ups I could do. Do what they tell you to do and they'll let you come home, she said. Yeah, home, I said sarcastically. I took the bus to the downtown jail, but the guards thought I'd made a mistake and didn't want to let me in. So I explained my situation and they looked at me like I was crazy. I started to get upset that I wasn't welcome in jail and told them to call my probation officer. After 2 long hours, they finally put the cuffs on and showed me to my room. For the next few months, I was locked in cages with hardcore felons. I'd never be the same person I was going in. Most kids my age were finishing high school, going to prom, and planning their graduation party. I was learning about violence, crime, and sociopaths. Most of the inmates I was forced to interact with would spend their lives in and out of the system, never contributing much to society. I may have been young, but I knew these weren't the types of people I wanted to be around. It was hard to grasp exactly how I got there, but this was my life, and it was up to me to do everything I could to improve it. That was chapter 1 of my book, Gonzo Education. My name is Gregory Brandt. This book is available on Amazon for less than $10. The link's probably in the comments below. Help me grow this channel, help me grow this book. I know you enjoyed that. It's a really great book. This book starts when I drop out of high school at age 15, and it ends when I graduate from one of the top journalism schools in the country. So you know it's really well written, and it's a really great story. So keep watching, hit the thumbs up button, smash the subscribe button, but most importantly, check out this book. I think you can get it free on Kindle right now, and send it to one person, okay? Tell them about the story, because more people have walked on the moon than have done what I did here. So, all right, peace. Hook 'em horns.